Hey everyone, John Chappell, and this is the final PowerPoint in our coverage of the Nixon administration. This is part 2 of the Watergate scandal. As we'll see in this PowerPoint, Richard Nixon becomes the first sitting president in American history to resign from office. So let's jump in and see how this comes about. In the first part of my coverage of Watergate, the other PowerPoint that I did on the Watergate scandal, we talked about how the scandal unfolded, the initial events connected to it, and the testimony by a variety of witnesses to the Urban Committee, the most damaging of which came from Nixon's White House attorney, White House counsel, John Dean. And this set up a showdown because throughout the Watergate investigation, Nixon had insisted that he was telling the truth, which, if that was true, meant that everybody else who testified against him was lying, which seemed highly unlikely. But this was the conundrum that the Urban Committee faced. And it was one of the final witnesses, actually a quite low-level person, who disclosed that the White House had an elaborate recording system that was automated that Nixon had installed when he came to office. Now, previous presidents had recorded some conversations. This one as far back as Franklin Roosevelt. We have some taped recordings of phone conversations that Franklin Roosevelt carried out in the Oval Office. John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson both recorded phone conversations extensively, although they didn't record every one. And primarily the purpose for this was to have a record of conversations that then would be placed in presidential libraries for use by scholars and the public. And this was Nixon's intent with this recording system too. He took it a step further and had a system installed in the Oval Office that was automatic. So by our standards, this is still pretty primitive because you're talking about a big reel-to-reel taping system. This is before the digital age. But it was automated, meaning that whenever any conversation started in the Oval Office, this thing automatically kicked in, and there was a staff member who had the task each day of reviewing, putting in fresh tapes, and all of this stuff was saved and archived. And Nixon's purpose in doing it was to have what he thought would be a valuable historical resource for the Nixon Presidential Library after he retired from politics. Nixon had a keen interest in history, loved reading history as a subject. So the motivation for this isn't anything sinister. It's Nixon thinking that he'll have this documented, recorded evidence of a lot of important conversations and even just some of the run-of-the-mill conversations that went on in the Oval Office. Now, of course, he's hoping to edit this stuff for reasons that we'll get into in the next couple slides, but that was the purpose for having the taping system initially. So you can see where this is going, that this sets up a situation where once the Urban Committee learns that you have taped recordings, they can take testimony like John Dean's, for example. So Dean says, yeah, June 22nd, I met with Richard Nixon at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We met for 30 minutes. This is what we discussed. This is what he said about the break-in. This is what he authorized. You've got all that detailed testimony, particularly from Dean, but from other witnesses too. So now, if you're the committee, you can request tape recordings of specific dates and times and see what was said and get to the bottom of who's telling the truth. Well, as I saw in that previous slide, Nixon claimed executive privilege over all these recorded conversations and refused to turn them over. He fired several people in the Justice Department who were involved in trying to secure the tapes, and this made Nixon look, as I note here, as if he had something to hide. And at one famous press conference, Nixon insisted, well, the American people have a right to know whether their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. Well, more and more Americans were starting to believe if Nixon wasn't a crook, that he certainly was a dishonest president. So the Ervin Committee pursues this through the courts because Nixon refuses to comply. So it starts working its way through the federal court system, and that they have subpoenaed specific tapes. Nixon recognizes that this is probably going to reach the U.S. Supreme Court, and he decides to take preemptive action. And in a televised speech, he releases edited versions of tapes he had selected, not the specific ones that the committee had requested, but others, in a kind of desperate last attempt to prove his innocence. He said that this would vindicate him, but it completely backfired. None of these tapes incriminated Nixon, of course, because he wouldn't release anything that did that, but they didn't help his image with the public. Like any of us, if you had somebody follow me or one of you in class around during the day, we're going to say things that we wouldn't necessarily want other people to hear. Most of us, especially in casual conversation or conversation with friends, we may be freer with profanity than, say, you would be if you were talking to one of your professors or talking to your parents. Nixon cursed frequently. I would say his use of profanity was not as extensive as Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy, both of whom we know from taped recordings, including the one I played for you in class of Kennedy. Johnson and Kennedy were both frequent F-bombers, and Nixon almost never used that term. But he used a variety of other swear words, I guess you could say, and when these were released to the public, published in newspapers, that was blocked out with the phrase expletive deleted. And so it became kind of a humorous thing that Americans did. You could read this in the paper, and usually you could figure out what the word was that had been blocked. So that very quickly became a punchline on late night television. Beyond that, Nixon was a person who frequently used ethnic and racial slurs, and these appeared quite a bit in these taped conversations that he released too. So none of this, as I say, although none of it was incriminating, none of it was flattering, and it did nothing to help Nixon's image. By 1974, the U.S. Supreme Court rules against Nixon, forcing him to release specific requested tapes, and once those are out and listened to, it becomes explicitly clear that Nixon had been lying to the public and Congress for months, and that from the beginning he had been actively engaged in the Watergate cover-up. Now again, I want to emphasize a point that I made, and Eric Foner mentions this too. I made this point earlier. There has never been any evidence produced that indicated that Nixon knew anything about the placing of listening devices on phones in the offices of the Democratic National Committee. That was done without his knowledge, without his approval, by people working in the Nixon campaign. But once that comes to light through the arrest of the Watergate burglars, and Nixon does learn about it, rather than being forthcoming, rather than trying to get to the bottom of what happened, rather than being candid with the American public and with Congress, he goes into damage control mode and actively engages in the cover-up, as it was called, of what had happened. And so by this point, it was clear that Nixon would face impeachment. And you all are more familiar with this because of President Trump having recently been impeached. But being impeached means that Congress brings charges against a president after a series of hearings. At that point, those charges advance to the Senate, where there's a trial, and the Senate votes. And in Trump's case, he was not convicted. In Nixon's case, it was absolutely clear that he would be convicted. Once these tapes were released, the last bits of support that Nixon had, even from members of his own party, completely disappeared. And so Nixon is in a position where he knows he's going to face impeachment and certain conviction, and rather than face that, he decides to resign from office. Nixon gave a tearful farewell to his staff, and then, in one of the strangest moments in American history, he walks to the helicopter that's going to take him to Air Force One to take him home to California. Here he is resigning, leaving office in total disgrace, and he turns before getting on the helicopter and gives this gesture of victory that he had used on the campaign trail going back to 1968. What he was thinking, I have no idea. It's one of the most famous photographs of Nixon and one of the oddest moments in American history. So, very quickly, some of the consequences of the Watergate scandal. So, Nixon's actions, as I've mentioned in the previous PowerPoint and in this one, included lying, obstruction of justice by interfering with multiple investigations of the Watergate scandal, and what qualifies as abuse of power. It came out that Nixon had used both the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Central Intelligence Agency, all three of those agencies, to harass critics, including journalists. And this was a complete violation of the charter of the CIA, which is not supposed to be engaged in any sort of domestic intelligence work of that sort. It was revealed that Nixon maintained a running enemies list of people, as he said on one tape, that he wanted to screw over. And there were politicians, there were journalists, there were ordinary people, academics. The actor Paul Newman was on there. One of the most curious people on the list was New York Jets quarterback Joe Namath, who never could figure out what he had done to offend Richard Nixon. Nobody else has either, although Nixon was a New York Giants fan. He was a big football fan. So that was kind of a funny element that Namath ended up being on the enemies list as well. I think that Nixon's actions were a serious blow to public trust in the presidency and government in general. And I think we're still living with the consequences of this, because in the decades since Watergate, you've seen far less trust in government and much more cynicism about government and politics in general among Americans. This is kind of a 1-2 punch, because the Vietnam War involved a lot of institutional deceit and lying by presidents, by the military, and the Watergate scandal built on that distrust. Among conservatives, and by that I'm meaning primarily Republicans, this did lead to a renewed sense to limit government power, and it helped contribute to the rise of Ronald Reagan in the 80s, who would famously say that in his inaugural address, government isn't the solution, it's part of the problem. And this is the same outlook that leads to the rise of the Tea Party movement within the Republican Party later on during Barack Obama's presidency. Just want to wrap up with a couple quick things to recommend. 2 movies about this, All the President's Men, which is based on an excellent book by the same title that Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein wrote about their investigations as Washington Post reporters. And the film starred Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. It's a very accurate depiction of what happened. The other movie I want to recommend is a film called Dick that came out in 1999 with Kirsten Dunst and Michelle Williams. Hilarious, very clever movie. One of them, they're best friends. One of them lives on the Watergate building. They witness part of the break-in, become caught up in the scandal. This movie is very accurate, except for them playing a role, and it's a very clever film, very funny, that addresses the Watergate scandal in a very unique way.